Focusing on making your novel a series can lead to serious problems. Making a story span across multiple books brings all sorts of challenges. Figuring out character arcs and plot arcs and world building stuff for just one book is tough. Doing that for more than one is even tougher. Making your novel into a series can be seriously bad and not something that you should approach lightly. Now, this might sound like I'm trying to discourage you from writing a series, which I kind of am, but there's more nuance here. A series is not something you should just take on a whim. There's a lot of considerations that go into choosing to write one, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to discuss some of the problems that can happen when you try to approach a series and why, for a lot of writers, new writers especially, focusing on standalone novels is probably a better bet. The biggest issue that can happen when you try to write a series is taking away focus from any one installment in that series. When the quality of individual novels suffer in service to the overall story of a series, that's when a series becomes problematic. This has ramifications for the books, obviously, but can also be problematic for you as a writer. If you commit to writing something that's ultimately a flawed novel in service of a bigger series, you're effectively destroying an opportunity to work on a novel that isn't flawed. As a beginner or newer writer especially, you have so many difficulties, there's so many things working against you when you're trying to complete a novel that adding the extra work, the extra burden of a series to that is maybe not that wise of a decision. After all, a series is not just about padding out a story so that it takes 3 books instead of 1. It is about telling a bigger story and chopping that story up into interesting segments and making sure that each segment is enjoyable on its own. This is not an easy thing to do. Regardless of whether a novel is part of a series or not, you should still be striving to make that novel as good as you possibly can. It should be able to stand on its own merits story-wise, even if it's meant to fit into a broader narrative of an entire series. And when I say stand alone, I obviously don't mean that elements and characters and things can't carry over from other books. Yes, a reader needs to have read books 1 through 4 in order to understand what's going on in book 5, but book 5 should still feel like a complete, satisfying story. It should stand on its own as a good novel, even though understanding it means understanding what else is going on in the series. You need to have the ability to give the reader enough resolution in one story, but leave enough threads unclosed, leave enough threads hanging to keep the reader interested in the next book. It's like you have to give them a satisfying meal, but you also have to make sure that they're still hungry to eat more. Readers of The Wheel of Time will have heard of The Slog, which is a group of books in the middle of that series, either books 7 to 10 or books 6 to 11, depending on who you talk to. These are books which are generally considered to be not as good as the rest of the series and more challenging to get through. And the chief complaint about that part of the series, the reason that people call it the slog, is that the books stop becoming complete stories on their own and instead focus on arcs that span more than one book. So with every book in the slog, there's less satisfaction, there's less resolution, there's less of a conclusion within those individual books, which makes each one of them on their own less enjoyable. People talk a lot about middle book syndrome, where the first book in usually a trilogy is pretty good, but then the second book is just kind of meh, kind of filler, not really moving the story along, and then maybe the third book is good because it brings things to a close. This is another major challenge with a series. The first book, you have novelty and intrigue and excitement. The third book, you have lots of resolution, you're bringing things to a close, you're answering lots of questions. But then the middle book is kind of tricky. Now, this pattern can happen in individual novels too. The middle of a story is notoriously hard to write for the same reasons. There's none of the excitement and novelty of the opening, and there's not the climactic action of the ending. It's challenging enough when this happens in an individual novel, but at least with an individual novel, there's a chance to redeem yourself in the same book. In a trilogy, or even a longer series, the reader has to survive an entire book that might be lackluster. That's a much harder thing to get through. Beyond potential issues with reader enjoyment, I think especially for new writers, trying to write a series can be detrimental to your progress as a writer. There's a lot of bad habits that writing a series can encourage when not approached properly. A series requires a lot of content. You need a lot of story arcs, you need a lot of plot beats, you need a big cast of characters. Making a story more complex is relatively easy. You just add more to it. You put more characters, more arcs, more world building stuff into it. Complexity is relatively straightforward to add. Making a story have more substance, more depth, is where things get difficult. Substance requires excellent writing. Substance is something that emerges out of the reader's connection and interest in the story. A series requires making a lot of writing with a lot of substance, a lot of writing with a lot of depth in order to pull somebody through a story that is that size. This is not the same thing as just making a complex, bloated story that takes 3 novels when it could reasonably be told in 1. Complexity alone will make a story feel like it's being padded, like it's being stretched to fill a desired length. So what should you do here if you want to or are thinking about writing a series? I'm trying to provide more concrete, sort of actionable things that people can take away from these videos and actually use what's talked about in these videos. So I'm going to try to do that here and we'll see if it works out. The first thing I would recommend, especially if you're a beginner writer, is to try to write the series that you have in mind as a standalone. If this is your first kick at the can, the idea that you have probably doesn't have enough substance to stretch into a trilogy, let alone like a 15-book series. You will get more out of trying to write a decent standalone than you will out of trying to pad out your idea to a series. Don't wait to execute on the good ideas you have for resolution of arcs and character arcs and things like that. Don't wait to do that in book 3. Try to do that in 1 book. If that means you have to cut some elements, then that's totally fine. A more focused standalone is better for your skill advancement anyway. I think there is always, with any well-written standalone, I think there is always opportunity to turn it into a series, unless you absolutely finish off every single arc that's introduced in the story. Introducing arcs, just kind of hinting at things but not really resolving them, can leave a lot of doors open for further events that happen in subsequent books. So focusing on writing a standalone does not necessarily mean that the book will end up only being a standalone. A good example of this, I think, is the Mistborn trilogy. The first book in that series is very much a standalone. It could have stayed that 1 book, but it was expanded to a trilogy and beyond a trilogy, because I think there's a whole series of Mistborn books now beyond just the original 3. But what happened in that first book was there were these things hinted at, there was kind of a bigger story implied, there were some threads left dangling at the end of that first book, but that first book still stands on its own as a complete, satisfying story that brings an arc to an end. The other thing that I can recommend here is, as you read, and you should be reading a ton, try to figure out what the author is doing as far as substance, whether the book you're reading is a standalone or it's part of a series. Substance or depth, same thing, same word, is not complexity. Substance is what a series or even a single novel needs to be filled with. This is a feeling that's created by good writing. It is a feeling that makes the reader connect with the story. Try to understand what authors are doing that create that feeling. What are they doing that makes you want to continue reading multiple books in a series? It's not just about the complexity. It's not just the number of characters they have or the number of plot elements or the complexity of the world or anything like that. There's more to it. There's more depth to what they're doing. It's really tough to figure this out, and you've got to pay a lot of attention, but that's what you need to master if you want to write a series. I don't want to discourage you from taking on a series if that's what you eventually want to do. What I want you to be aware of, though, are the challenges and the additional complexity that gets added to the process when you try to take on something like a series. There's nothing wrong with focusing on standalone stories. There's a lot that you can learn there. And for most writers, that's a better thing to do anyway. So there you have it. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.